Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. The year is 1603. In the silent, gilded heart of Topkapi Palace, a 13-year-old boy has just become the master of the world. But power demands a terrible price. By a law written in blood, Sultan Ahmed I must order the execution of his little brother, Mustafa. The silk bowstring is ready. The court holds its breath. For centuries, this brutal act has secured the throne. But on this night, one boy's conscience will wage war against an empire's tradition, and his decision will change the course of history forever. The year is 1603. Within the labyrinthine corridors of the Topkapi Palace, a silence hangs heavy, thick with fear and uncertainty. Sultan Mehmed III is dead. His reign, marked by the blood of his 19 brothers, strangled with silk cords on the very day of his accession, has ended as abruptly as it began. The empire, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Arabia, holds its breath. For the man who now inherits the throne of Osman is not a man at all. He is a boy. Ahmed I, at the tender age of 13, is summoned from his gilded cage within the palace. He has spent his life in the shadow of his father's paranoia, a prince who could be a threat, a life that could be extinguished at any moment. Now, that shadow has passed, only to be replaced by the blinding, terrifying light of absolute power. As he walks towards the imperial hall, the weight of the Ottoman dynasty settles upon his slender shoulders. He is no longer just Ahmed. He is the Padishah, the Caliph of the faithful, the shadow of God on earth. The court physicians whisper of poison, of a sudden illness, but the truth is irrelevant. Power has shifted, and the ancient bloody machinery of succession grinds into motion. Ministers, generals, and eunuchs watch him, their faces masks of feigned loyalty, their minds calculating, their allegiances shifting like desert sands. They see a child, perhaps one they can manipulate. They see an opportunity. But what they fail to see is the mind behind the boy's dark, intelligent eyes, a mind that has witnessed the cost of power firsthand and is already wrestling with a decision that could shatter a century and a half of imperial tradition. To understand the choice facing the boy sultan, one must first understand the iron law that governed his family, a law codified by his ancestor, the great conqueror Mehmed II. It was a law of brutal, pragmatic necessity, known as the Law of Fratricide. After conquering Constantinople, Mehmed saw the chaos that had nearly torn the empire apart in previous generations. Civil wars between brothers, each claiming the throne, each backed by rival factions, bleeding the state dry. His solution was as ruthless as it was effective. The decree was chillingly clear. For the welfare of the state, the one of my sons to whom God grants the sultanate may lawfully put his brothers to death. It was not a suggestion. It was a sacred duty. The stability of the world's most powerful empire rested on the principle that there could be only one sun in the sky and only one sultan on the throne. Any other prince was a potential rebel, a rallying point for dissent, a seed of civil war waiting to sprout. And so, for over 150 years, the law was obeyed. Accession Day was synonymous with Execution Day. As a new sultan claimed his power, the silent executioners, the deaf mutes of the palace, would move through the royal apartments with their silk cords. The cord was key. Shedding royal blood was forbidden, so strangulation became the grim, sanctified method. This was the tradition Ahmed was born into. It was as much a part of the sultanate as the throne itself. To defy it was not merely a personal choice. It was to question the wisdom of conquerors, to challenge the very foundation of Ottoman stability, and to invite the chaos his ancestors had paid such a terrible price to prevent. In a secluded chamber deep within the Topkapi, far from the grand ceremonies of accession, lived the reason for Ahmed's torment. His name was Mustafa. He was not a rival claimant plotting in the dark. He was a small child, a half-brother, whose only crime was sharing the blood of Osman. The historical records of Mustafa's early years are sparse, painting a picture of a life lived in gilded isolation. A prince kept ignorant of the deadly politics swirling around him. We know he was considered by many to be mentally unstable, or at the very least, different. This may have been a genuine condition, or it could have been a convenient label applied by court factions to diminish his threat. To the Grand Viziers and the military commanders, Mustafa was a pawn, a living symbol of the old law. His continued existence was a deviation from the norm, a dangerous anomaly. They saw him not as a boy, but as a problem to be solved, a loose thread that could unravel the entire tapestry of the state. But to Ahmed, he was something more. He was the face of the terrible tradition he was now expected to uphold. Did he remember playing with his younger brother in the palace gardens? Did he see in Mustafa's eyes a reflection of his own fear, the fear of a prince whose life was not his own? We can only speculate. What is certain is that Mustafa was not an abstract concept. He was flesh and blood. He was the human cost of the law. Every whisper from his advisors, every expectant glance from the pillars of the state, was a demand for this child's life. The pressure was immense, a psychological siege laid upon a 13-year-old ruler, forcing him to choose between the perceived good of an empire and the life of his own brother. The night of December 21st, 1603. The air in Topkapi is electric. Ahmed I has been girded with the sword of Osman, the sacred ceremony complete. He is, in the eyes of God and man, the Sultan. Now, the court waits. The Grand Vizier Yavuz Ali Pasha, the Sheikh-ul-Islam, the Aga of the Janissaries, they all stand in silent anticipation. They know the ritual. They have seen it before. Somewhere in the palace, the deaf-mute executioners have prepared their silk cords. Their hands are steady, their purpose clear, honed by generations of grim service. They await a single word, a subtle nod from the new Padishah. This is the final bloody seal on his ascension. Hours pass. The torches flicker, casting long, dancing shadows on the marble walls. The silence in the throne room deepens, becoming a deafening roar of expectation. Every courtier, every guard, is acutely aware of what is not happening. The order is not being given. The executioners are not being summoned. Whispers begin to circulate. Is the boy hesitating? Is he weak? Or is this something else entirely? The viziers would have counselled him, reminded him of his duty, of the ghosts of civil wars past. They would have spoken of statecraft, of necessity, of the greater good that demanded this small private evil. Yet the child on the throne remains silent. He does not yield. This is the moment of rupture, the quiet, terrifying break, with a century and a half of history. It is a rebellion not of armies, but of conscience. As the night wears on and the sun threatens to rise on a new day, the unthinkable becomes reality. The executioners remain idle. The silk cords stay coiled. Prince Mustafa, asleep in his chambers, is allowed to live. The night the executioners waited would become the night everything changed. The silence that followed Sultan Ahmed's decree was not one of relief, but of profound, unnerving shock. In the marbled halls of Topkapi, where the ghosts of murdered princes lingered in every shadow, this act of clemency was not seen as compassion. It was a violation of the natural order, a crack in the very foundation of imperial stability. The law of fratricide, established by Mehmed the Conqueror, was a brutal but effective tool. It cauterized the wound of civil war before it could fester. By sparing his brother Mustafa, the 13-year-old Ahmed had, in the eyes of his court, just invited the disease back into the heart of the empire. His own mother, the Valide Handan Sultan, was aghast. She, who had schemed and fought to see her son on the throne, now saw his reign imperiled by his own youthful sentimentality. The Grand Vizier, the formidable Sheikh al-Islam, the grizzled Aga of the Janissaries, they all saw the same thing, a living, breathing alternative to the Sultan. Mustafa was no longer just a boy, he was a symbol. Every faction disgruntled with Ahmed's policies, every ambitious pasha, Every plotter whispering in the dark now had a figurehead to rally behind. The decision was interpreted not as strength, but as a fatal weakness. Whispers turned to plots. Was the Sultan too young, too pious, too soft to wield the bloody sword of Osman? The pressure mounted on him to reconsider, to spill the blood that tradition demanded. He was told that his mercy was a betrayal of his ancestors and a death sentence for the state. Every day, Ahmed had to live with the consequences of his choice, a choice that made him a sovereign of unprecedented mercy, but also a ruler perpetually looking over his shoulder, waiting for the storm of treason that his own kindness had brewed. Ahmed's mercy required an invention of equal magnitude. If the sword was to be sheathed, a new kind of prison had to be forged. Thus was born one of the most curious and cruel institutions of the Ottoman court, the cafes, or the cage. This was not a dungeon of stone and iron bars. It was a suite of opulent rooms tucked away in a secluded part of the Topkapi Palace, a gilded prison designed to neutralize a prince without the stain of his blood. Mustafa was escorted into this luxurious confinement, a world of silk cushions, intricate tilework, and latticed windows that offered no view of the world outside. He was surrounded by immense wealth, but starved of human connection. His companions were deaf-mute servants, ensuring that no word of conspiracy could pass in or out. He received no training in governance, no lessons in military strategy, no knowledge of the empire he was, by blood, a potential heir to. The goal of the cafes was not merely to contain the body, but to atrophy the mind. It was a living death, a slow psychological erosion designed to render a prince harmless, to make him a ghost long before his time. This solution, born of Ahmed's desire to avoid fratricide, would become his most enduring and tragic legacy. He had ended one bloody tradition only to create another, more insidious one. For the next 3 centuries, potential heirs to the Ottoman throne would be raised in this silent, suffocating splendor. They would emerge, if they emerged at all, not as capable statesmen, but as broken, paranoid, and dangerously unprepared men, blinking in the sunlight after decades spent in the twilight of the golden cage. Ahmed had solved his immediate problem, but in doing so, he had planted the seeds of the empire's future decay, a slow-acting poison born from a single act of mercy. Haunted by accusations of weakness, Ahmed knew he had to rule with an iron fist cloaked in a velvet glove of piety. His reign became a desperate performance of strength, a constant effort to prove that his mercy towards his brother was not a flaw. He threw himself into the grinding machinery of the state and the crucible of war. To the west, the long Turkish war against the Habsburgs raged on, a bloody stalemate that had drained the treasury for years. Ahmed, seeking an end to the conflict, signed the Treaty of Jitvatorok. It was a pragmatic peace, but a blow to Ottoman pride. For the first time, the Sultan was forced to recognize the Holy Roman Emperor as his equal, abandoning the centuries-old title of Caesar. This perceived humiliation only fueled his need for a grand, undeniable statement of his power. If his might on the battlefield was questioned, his devotion to God would be monumental. He turned his ambition to the skyline of Constantinople itself, ordering the construction of a mosque so magnificent it would rival the Hagia Sophia. The Sultan Ahmed Mosque, known to the world as the Blue Mosque, was born. It was an act of audacious piety and imperial ego. He funded it from the state treasury, a controversial move during wartime, and commanded his architect to adorn it with 6 minarets, a design that dared to match the holy sanctuary at Mecca. This was Ahmed's answer to his critics. It was a declaration in stone and tile that he was the chosen servant of God, a Ghazi sultan whose legacy would be remembered not for the brother he spared, but for the monument he raised to the glory of Islam and the enduring power of his dynasty. He was forging a new identity, a sultan of faith, whose wars were fought not just on land, but in the hearts and minds of his people. While Sultan Ahmed built his mosque and waged his wars, a spectre haunted the corridors of his palace. It was the ghost of a living man, his brother, Mustafa. Locked away in the gilded silence of the cafes, Mustafa was a constant, unspoken presence in Ahmed's mind. Every military setback, every whisper of a Janissary revolt, every political failure served as a chilling reminder of the alternative ruler living just steps away from the throne room. The cafes was not a perfect solution. It was a holding cell for a political time bomb. Reports trickled out from the deaf-mute servants of Prince Mustafa's deteriorating mental state. Years of absolute isolation, with no purpose and no future, were fracturing his sanity. He would veer between deep melancholy and fits of frantic paranoia. This news brought Ahmed no comfort. A sane, competent rival was a danger, but an unstable one was a catastrophe waiting to happen. What if a powerful faction decided to install this damaged prince on the throne, using him as their puppet? The weight of this possibility was immense. Ahmed, the ruler of a vast empire, was in a psychological prison of his own making, tethered to the fate of the man he had saved. As the years wore on, the strain took its toll. At the age of just 27, the Sultan fell gravely ill with typhus. As his life ebbed away, the terrifying reality of his decision came into sharp focus. His own sons were mere children, too young to rule. The only viable heir was the man in the cage. The brother he had refused to kill was now poised to inherit everything. The act of mercy from 14 years prior had come full circle, creating a crisis of succession unlike any the empire had ever seen. Ahmed's reign was ending, and the ghost in the palace was about to walk free. While the fate of Prince Mustafa played out in gilded silence, a new power was coalescing in the heart of the harem. She arrived at Topkapi as a slave, a Greek girl named Anastasia, captured in her youth and presented as a gift to the new sultan. But within the perfumed halls and shadowed corridors of the imperial harem, she would be reborn. Ahmed, captivated by her striking intelligence as much as her beauty, gave her the name Kosum, meaning leader of the flock. It was a prophetic title. Kosum was no mere concubine destined to be forgotten. She was a political prodigy. She quickly understood that in the Ottoman court, love was a currency, but children, specifically sons, were the ultimate source of power. She would bear Ahmed numerous children, including the future sultans Murad IV and Ibrahim, cementing her status as his Haseki, his chief consort. But her ambition reached far beyond the sultan's bedchamber. The abolition of fratricide had fundamentally altered the political calculus. The game was no longer a brutal sprint to ensure one's son was the last one standing. It was now a complex, long-term chess match of influence, alliance building, and public perception. Kosum mastered this new game with terrifying skill. She cultivated relationships with powerful viziers, corresponded with foreign ambassadors, and, most critically, won the loyalty of the Janissary corps through calculated acts of charity and patronage. She understood that the Sultan's power was absolute, but his life was fleeting. Her own power had to be built on a foundation of wealth, loyalty, and the promise of her son's future reign. While Ahmed ruled the empire, Kosum began to quietly rule the palace, positioning herself not merely as the mother of princes, but as the future queen regent, a shadow empress waiting for the inevitable moment when fate would call upon her to step into the light. Beyond the palace walls, the empire that Mehmed I had inherited was groaning under the weight of its own glorious past. The age of lightning-fast expansion was over, replaced by a grueling reality of static fronts and costly stalemates. In the west, the long Turkish war against the Habsburgs finally sputtered to a conclusion with the Peace of Zitvatarok in 1606. For the first time, the Ottoman Sultan was forced to recognize the Habsburg Emperor as an equal, addressing him as Caesar rather than the customary King of Vienna. For the proud Ottoman elite, this was not peace. It was a humiliation, a sign that the infidel world no longer trembled before the Padishah. To the east, the situation was even more dire. The brilliant and ruthless Shah Abbas, the great of Safavid Persia, had rebuilt his army and was now reclaiming territories lost a generation earlier. Cities like Baghdad, Yerevan, and vast swathes of the Caucasus fell from Ottoman control in a series of bloody campaigns that drained the imperial treasury and shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. Yet the most dangerous threat was not external, but internal. The heartland of Anatolia was on fire with the Jalali revolts. What began as discontent among provincial soldiers spiraled into a full-blown civil war. Disbanded mercenaries, overtaxed peasants, and ambitious local governors raised banners of rebellion, plunging the countryside into anarchy. Entire regions fell outside of Istanbul's control. Ahmed's reign was a constant, desperate struggle to plug these gaping wounds, sending armies east to fight the Persians, west to placate the Austrians, and into his own lands to hunt down rebels. The empire was fighting a war on 3 fronts, and the cost was measured in debased currency, rampant inflation, and the growing despair of its people. Ahmed's moral revolution in the palace was a noble act, but it took place in a house whose very foundations were beginning to crack. Sultan Ahmed's mercy had an unforeseen and terrible consequence. In sparing his brother, he had created a new kind of prison, one not of stone and iron, but of silence and dread. Prince Mustafa was confined to the cafes, the cage, a luxurious suite of rooms deep within the palace. He was surrounded by opulent silks and served the finest food, but he was utterly alone, attended only by deaf-mute servants. For years, he lived under the shadow of the executioner's bowstring. Every unexpected footstep in the corridor, every change of the guard, was a potential prelude to his death. This constant grinding terror, combined with absolute isolation, did what no assassin could. It unraveled his mind. The prince slowly descended into a profound madness. Visitors, on the rare occasions they were permitted, reported a man lost in a world of his own. He would spend hours staring at the walls, have violent, unpredictable outbursts of rage, or fall into deep states of catatonic depression. His piety became extreme, a desperate, obsessive attempt to bargain with a god he believed had abandoned him. He was a ghost haunting the imperial family, a living testament to the cruelty of their new, enlightened system. Mustafa's condition was more than a personal tragedy. It was a looming political catastrophe. According to the ancient tradition of seniority that Ahmed himself had now prioritized, Mustafa was the heir to the throne. But how could a man so clearly detached from reality possibly rule the world's most powerful empire? His existence created a constitutional crisis that had never before been contemplated. He was the rightful heir, yet demonstrably unfit. This single broken man became the central dilemma of Ottoman succession. Ahmed's humane decision had saved a life, but in doing so, it had planted a seed of insanity at the very heart of the dynasty, a time bomb of chaos waiting for the moment the Sultan's own life came to an end. In the autumn of 1617, a chill fell over Istanbul that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. Sultan Ahmed I, the pious builder of the Blue Mosque, the ruler who had defied centuries of bloody tradition, was only 27 years old. He should have been in the prime of his life, with decades of rule ahead of him. Instead, he was struck down by a virulent sickness. The court physicians, powerless against the typhus that raged through the city's crowded quarters, could only watch as a burning fever consumed their sovereign. The news spread through the Topkapi Palace like a poison, transforming the atmosphere from one of routine governance to one of frantic, whispered conspiracy. The entire political order rested on the life of this one man, and that life was now fading. Panic gripped the court. Ahmed's sons were all still children. The eldest, Osman, was a promising but untested boy of 13. He was too young to command the respect of the grizzled viziers and the fiercely independent janissaries. As the Sultan's condition worsened, the great men of the empire were forced to confront the dilemma that Ahmed's clemency had created. The succession, once a simple matter of the last brother standing, was now a terrifying choice between two impossible options. On one hand was the child, Prince Osman, whose ascension would mean a long and unstable regency. On the other was the man locked away in the cafes, the rightful heir by seniority, Prince Mustafa, whose sanity had long since crumbled into dust. As Ahmed lay delirious on his deathbed, the factions began to move. Kösem Sultan fought to protect her own young sons, while military commanders and court officials weighed the odds, choosing between the madness of the uncle and the weakness of the nephew. Ahmed I's great act of mercy had been intended to bring stability. But as he drew his final ragged breaths, he must have realized the awful irony. His refusal to shed his brother's blood had not prevented a crisis, but had merely postponed it, leaving his empire teetering on the brink of an abyss. Sultan Ahmed I, the boy who ascended the throne in a storm of blood and fear, was now a man. He had survived, and in his survival had birthed a new, dangerous era. His decision to spare his brother Mustafa was a crack in the foundation of Ottoman power, a foundation mortared with the blood of princes for centuries. Now, he sought to build a new legacy, one not of fratricide, but of piety and monumental grandeur. Across from the ancient Hagia Sophia, a new marvel began to rise from the earth, the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which the world would come to know as the Blue Mosque. It was a statement in stone and tile, a challenge to the Byzantine emperors of old, a testament to his devotion. But devotion is expensive. The 6 towering minarets and the cascade of celestial domes were paid for from a treasury already bleeding from indecisive wars against the Habsburgs in the west and the Safavids in the east. While Ahmed prayed, his court plotted. His sons, the fiery firstborn Osman, and the younger princes from his beloved Kösem Sultan, Murad and Ibrahim, were no longer children. They were living, breathing succession crises. The question festered in the shadowed halls of Topkapi. When Ahmed dies, who will rule? Will it be his brother, Mustafa, the man whose life he spared, establishing a new principle of seniority? Or will it be his son, Osman, according to time-honored tradition? Kösem, a master of the long game, maneuvered silently, protecting her own sons, knowing that if Osman came to power, the law of fratricide might be violently resurrected. Ahmed, burdened by the weight of an empire and his own revolutionary choice, felt his youth failing him. He was building a monument to his faith, but the political house he had constructed was built on a fault line, and the tremors were just beginning. The end came not with a sword or a silken bowstring, but with a fever. In the autumn of 1617, typhus, the great equalizer, crept through the palace walls and seized the Sultan. Ahmed I, the ruler who dared to change the law of the dynasty, was dead at just 27 years old. His reign, which had begun with such a momentous decision, ended with a terrifying question mark. The crisis he had postponed for 14 years had finally arrived, demanding an immediate answer. Chaos gripped the divan. Who would succeed? The 2 paths diverged into madness and bloodshed. One path led to his eldest son, the 14-year-old Osman, an intelligent but dangerously ambitious prince. The other led back to the cafes, the gilded cage, and to his brother Mustafa, the man who had languished in isolation for a decade and a half. The old guard, the powerful Janissary commanders, and the high-ranking clergy saw in Osman a will of iron they could not bend. They feared a strong sultan who might curtail their power and privileges. It was Kösem Sultan, in a move of breathtaking political genius, who tipped the scales. Her own sons were too young to rule. If Osman took the throne, he would almost certainly execute his half-brothers, including her beloved Murad, to secure his power. A return to fratricide was unthinkable. She argued for Mustafa. He was weak, his mind fractured by long confinement. He would be a puppet, a placeholder. Under his name, she could protect her children and consolidate her power, buying precious time until her own son was ready. The alliance of self-interest was forged. The court chose the path of perceived control over the path of tradition. The order was given. The heavy doors of the cafes, sealed for 14 years, groaned open. Out into the light stumbled a man-child, blinking, terrified, his mind a ruin. The forgotten prince, Mustafa, was now the Padishah, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The enthronement of Mustafa I was a spectacle of profound delusion. The court thought they had crowned a pawn. They soon discovered they had unleashed a ghost. The 14 years Mustafa had spent in the cafes, listening for the footsteps of the executioner, had not merely broken his spirit, they had shattered his mind. The intricate machinery of the Ottoman state ground to a halt, paralyzed by a ruler who could not rule. Mustafa's behavior became the stuff of dark legend within the palace walls. He would roam the gardens, calling out for his long-dead nephew, Sultan Ahmed. He was seen frantically tearing at his own turban, a grave insult to his office, and pulling the beards of his aghast viziers during council meetings. In a display of his detachment from reality, he would take sacks of gold coins and spend hours at the water's edge, throwing them one by one for the fish to eat, laughing at the shimmering patterns. The empire had a hole at its center. Power, abhorring a vacuum, was wielded by the clique that had placed him on the throne, his mother, Halime Sultan, the Grand Vizier, and the ever-watchful Kosem. But governing through a madman proved impossible. His public appearances were a source of immense embarrassment and instability. The Janissaries, who had supported his accession hoping for a pliable master, grew contemptuous of the holy fool they had crowned. The experiment had been a catastrophic failure. After just 96 days, the illusion collapsed. The same state officials who had led Mustafa from the cafes to the throne now gently escorted him back. The door to the gilded cage closed once more on the mad sultan. His first reign was over. The throne was empty again, and the court, having exhausted its cleverest option, was now forced to turn to the one they had feared most, the young, proud, and formidable son of Ahmed, Osman. In February 1618, Osman II ascended to the throne. At just 14, he possessed an intelligence and fierce will that stunned the court. He was no placeholder, no puppet. He was the son of Ahmed, but he was forged from a harder, more traditional metal. He had witnessed the chaos of his uncle's brief reign and saw it as a symptom of a deep sickness within the empire, a sickness caused by the insatiable greed of the Janissaries and the corrupt power of the palace elite. Osman was a reformer, but his methods were those of a hammer, not a scalpel. He immediately sought to reclaim the absolute authority of the Sultanate. He slashed the extravagant salaries of palace officials and curtailed the influence of the clergy. Fluent in Latin, Greek, and Persian, he was a Renaissance prince who chafed against the suffocating traditions he had inherited. His most audacious move was a direct assault on the empire's military heart. He blamed the Janissaries for a humiliating defeat in Poland, accusing them of cowardice and dereliction of duty. He openly spoke of his plans to shut down their coffee houses, the centers of their political dissent, and, most shockingly, to abolish the corps entirely. In their place, he would create a new, loyal army drawn from the Turkish heartlands of Anatolia and Syria. This was not reform. This was a declaration of war. He further broke with tradition by marrying the daughters of Turkish nobles, seeking to create a new aristocracy loyal to him, rather than relying on the slave system that had supplied the palace for centuries. But Osman was too young, too impatient. He made powerful enemies at every turn, underestimating the deep roots of the institutions he sought to destroy. He was a lone visionary on a throne surrounded by wolves, and the wolves were beginning to circle. The Janissaries, who had once dethroned a madman, now began to plot the downfall of a sultan they deemed far more dangerous, one who sought to take away their very existence. The mercy of Sultan Ahmed I, that quiet refusal to shed his brother's blood, was a stone cast into the dark waters of Ottoman history. But the ripples it created were not all of peace. The cafes, the gilded cage he had inadvertently created for his brother Mustafa, would soon hold his own sons, and from this cage, a new and terrible cycle of violence would be born. Ahmed's firstborn to ascend the throne was Osman II. Young, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious, Osman saw the rot that had set into the empire's foundations. He saw the Janissaries, once the elite slave soldiers of the Sultan, as a corrupt and seditious power unto themselves. He dreamed of radical reform, of creating a new army, of shifting the capital, of remaking the empire in his own image. But the empire was not ready for such a visionary, or perhaps he was not cunning enough to impose his vision upon it. In 1622, the very soldiers he sought to control rose against him. They dragged him from his palace, subjected him to public humiliation, and in a dark cell in the Yedikul fortress, they murdered him. It was an unprecedented horror. A sultan, the shadow of God on earth, strangled by his own servants. The shock of this regicide would forever scar the psyche of the dynasty. It fell to Osman's younger brother, Murad, to avenge him. But Murad was just a boy of 11 when he took the throne. For years, he was a puppet, his strings pulled by his formidable mother, Kösem Sultan, and the very palace factions that had murdered his brother. He watched, powerless, as the empire spiraled into chaos. The Janissaries ran rampant, Safavid armies encroached on the borders, and Anatolia burned with rebellion. But within this quiet, observant boy, a cold, unyielding rage was hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. The mercy of his father, Ahmed, had led to the murder of his brother, Osman. When Murad finally came of age, he would not make the same mistake. He would rule not with mercy, but with terror. When Sultan Murad IV seized the reins of power, it was as if a storm, long gathering, had finally broken over Istanbul. The boy who had watched his brother's murder in silence was now a man of terrifying strength and singular, brutal purpose: to restore order. His methods were direct and soaked in blood. He stalked the streets of his capital in disguise, his executioner at his side, cutting down anyone who broke his stringent laws. Corrupt officials, lazy soldiers, even commoners smoking tobacco or drinking coffee, all fell before his summary justice. He personally led his armies, recapturing Baghdad from the Safavids with a ferocity that stunned his enemies. He was the warrior sultan the empire had been crying out for, a throwback to the great conquerors of old. But this restoration of power came at a dreadful price. The ghosts of the past, the fear of usurpation that had haunted every sultan, whispered in his ear. In the cafes, his surviving brothers, Bayezid, Suleiman, and Qasim, lived in quiet seclusion. They were a potential rallying point for his enemies, a threat he could not ignore, especially when he was away on campaign. The compassionate legacy of his father, Ahmed I, was a luxury Murad believed the empire could no longer afford. And so, in 1635, on the eve of his great Yerevan campaign, Murad made a decision that echoed the darkest days of the dynasty. He ordered the execution of his brothers Bayezid and Suleiman. 3 years later, Qasim would meet the same fate. The silken bowstring, the instrument of Mehmed the Conqueror's bloody law, was brought out of retirement. The cafes, once a sanctuary, had become a death row. Only one brother, Ibrahim, was spared. He was widely considered to be mentally unstable, broken by years of terror in the cage, and thus was deemed no threat. The law of fratricide was back. The night of mercy had given way to a new dawn of blood, proving that in the Ottoman court, power and paranoia were inseparable. Ahmed I's decision, born of a desire to end the cycle of fratricide, had an unforeseen and crippling consequence. He had saved the lives of princes, but he had destroyed their training. The cafes, or the cage, became the new, permanent reality for all potential heirs. The old system, where young princes were sent to govern provinces as Sanjak Beys, was abolished. That system had been a crucible, forging boys into statesmen and generals. They learned to command armies, manage treasuries, and dispense justice. They built power bases and learned the intricate dance of diplomacy and war. It was a harsh education, but it produced rulers like Selim the Grim and Suleiman the Magnificent. The cafes, by contrast, was a vacuum. It was a world of gilded isolation, where princes passed their days and nights under constant surveillance, their only companions the deaf-mute servants and concubines sent to entertain them. They had no responsibilities, no training in statecraft, no experience of the world beyond their ornate prison walls. Every knock on the door could signal the arrival of the executioner. This environment did not forge leaders. It bred paranoia, depression, and often, madness. The result was a slow-motion catastrophe for the dynasty. The first fully-fledged product of this system was Sultan Ibrahim, the brother Murad IV had spared. When Murad died, Ibrahim was so terrified that he refused to leave the cafes, convinced it was a trick to murder him. He had to be physically dragged out to the throne. His reign was a disaster of debauchery, incompetence, and bizarre obsessions, culminating in his deposition and execution. He was the first in a long line of ill-prepared, unstable, or simply inept sultans who would emerge, blinking, from the darkness of the cafes to rule one of the world's great empires. Ahmed's act of mercy had inadvertently created a system that would slowly poison the dynasty from within, ensuring the empire's long, agonizing decline. So we return to that single moment, that fateful night in the Topkapi Palace, when a teenage sultan chose mercy over tradition. Did Ahmed I save his dynasty, or did he condemn it? History rarely offers simple answers. The Law of Fratricide, codified by Mehmed the Conqueror, was a monstrous solution to a genuine problem: the devastating civil wars of succession that had plagued so many other kingdoms. For 3 centuries, it had ensured, with brutal efficiency, that a single, unchallenged ruler sat on the throne. It guaranteed a certain quality of leader, one who had fought and schemed his way to the top. It was the engine of Ottoman expansion, a ruthless pragmatism that placed the stability of the state above the lives of princes. Ahmed's refusal was a profound moral turning point. It was a declaration that the lives of his family mattered, that the Sultan was a brother as well as a sovereign. Yet, this noble sentiment unleashed a cascade of unforeseen consequences. It led to the chaos of Mustafa I's reigns, the shocking regicide of Osman II, the reactive tyranny of Murad IV, and the institutionalized incompetence bred by the cafes. The empire traded the sharp, predictable horror of fratricide for the slow, creeping decay of weak leadership and palace intrigue. The problem of succession was not solved, it was merely transformed. Instead of princes killing princes, power now fell into the hands of ambitious viziers, palace factions, and the Janissary corps. The Sultan, once the absolute center of the universe, often became a pawn in their games. The story of Ahmed I is a testament to the tragic complexity of power. It reveals how an act of compassion can inadvertently weaken a state, and how a brutal law can be the bedrock of stability. The echoes of that night never truly faded. They resonated in the padded walls of the cafes, in the whispers of plotting viziers, and in the slow fracturing of a once mighty empire. Ahmed I chose humanity over policy, and in doing so, he changed the destiny of the Ottomans forever.